All right. Well, good morning, everyone. My plan was to have finished Numbers this morning, but I don't think we're going to make it due to the time. So let's see how far we can get. So we're taking a look at the last kind of part of Numbers, 33 to 36. We'll see how far we get this morning. Now, Numbers 33 is interesting. On the surface, it doesn't appear interesting at all, because the whole of chapter 33 is a detailed recounting of Israel's journey from the Red Sea to where they are at the end of the book of Numbers. And so it almost reads, it's almost as inspiring as sort of like a series of, MapQuest directions. Go down Thomasville Road, turn left, all that kind of stuff. I'll just read you a snippet of it to give you a sense of it. Then I want to say a few things about it. This is Numbers 33:1. These are the stages that the people of Israel, when they went out of the land of Egypt by their companies under the leadership of Moses and Aaron. Moses wrote down their starting places stage by stage by command of the Lord, and these are the stages according to their starting places. They set out from Ramses in the month and the 15th of the first month. On the day of the Passover, the people of Israel went out triumphantly in the sight of all the Egyptians, while the Egyptians were burying their firstborn, whom the Lord had struck down among them. On their gods also the Lord executed judgments. So the people of Israel set out from Ramses and camped at Sukkoth, and then it's a series of places. They went to here and stopped, and they went to here and stopped, and they went to here and stopped. Now, the question is why is this here? It doesn't seem to be very interesting, but that's, once again, I hope we've learned something, and that is, sometimes when Old Testament passages don't appear to be interesting, that doesn't mean they're not important. So we want to kind of stop and think about what's going on here. So a couple of things are going on here. The first is this. It's a brief little note, but it in effect offers the key to understanding everything in verse 33. While the Egyptians were burying all their firstborn, whom the Lord struck down among them, on their gods also the Lord executed judgments, referring to Egypt. That's for the children's class. That's why that bell's ringing. So you just got to deal with whatever here. So it's a really important note. That is, what we're being told here is that this isn't just a series of places. This is not just a sort of ancient version of MapQuest directions. Rather, we're being told here in a subtle way, but nevertheless in a true way, that we're going to start the capital campaign for the new building right now. I'll just go ahead and go forward. This journey that's being recounted in Numbers 33 is a journey that can only be made possible by God. That is, God's the one who brought them out of Egypt, and the reason why they are where they are right now is only because God has led them, right? And if you've been following the Numbers narrative, you know this. Remember, they didn't want to leave Egypt. When they finally left Egypt, some of them wanted to turn around. They complained all the journey through. They stopped before they entered the promised land, and there were still some people who wanted to turn back. That is, the only reason why Israel is where it is right now is because God has brought them to this point. And so the detailed journey actually is quite significant. It's saying, the only way that we got from where we were to where we are right now is because God brought it about. So that's an important theological message. Now, there's some other things that are going on here that we also want to explore. One of those things is what's the nature of this journey that we've been reading about in the book of Numbers? Well, on one level, right, it's a geographical journey, right? At one level, we've moved from Mount Sinai to the verge of crossing the Jordan River. So obviously, right, it's a geographical journey, but it's more than that. This is also a spiritual journey as well, and that's a really important point. That is, what's gone on here in the book of Numbers isn't just moving from point A to point B, but rather the book of Numbers is the story of what we can, I think, call legitimately a pilgrimage, a spiritual journey. So let me say a few things about that. There's, I think, a series of really important lessons that are to be learned from the journey that we've been reading about. And one of those lessons is that there's a sense in which God's people are always on pilgrimage until the coming of the kingdom of God, right? God's people haven't arrived truly at their destination point until the coming of God's kingdom. And therefore, it's really important that we actually know and understand what it is that we're doing. We're on a journey, a spiritual journey, and we're going to need some things to equip that journey and make it possible. And one of the things that we're going to need is we're going to have to realize that the journey is simultaneously dangerous and continuously challenging. That is, the journey's dangerous and it's continually challenging. Dangerous in the sense, right, that there are all manner of obstacles out there that will inhibit the journey. And we could sort of list those obstacles forever and ever, and they fall into two categories. One, external dangers, right? Things, people, and powers out there who want to disrupt the journey. That's one set of things. A second set of things is, as if that wasn't enough, there's also things within us that are obstacles to the journey, right? Our own lack of trust, our own lack of faith, our own lack of hope, our own unwillingness to deal with difficulty, right? All those things are obstacles in the journey as well. And so I think it's really important as we read the book of Numbers that we not kind of see it as a story of, oh, that's a story about those people back then. Oh yes, of course they went off and worshiped the Baal of Peor. Of course they rejected God. Of course they rebelled against Moses. Of course they were ungrateful, right? That's the way they were back then. That doesn't apply to us. No. Once again, one of my favorite ways of thinking about Scripture in this sense is, and some of you may have seen this, right? Rembrandt painted a painting of the stilling of the storm, right? That scene in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, remember? Where the disciples are in the midst of the storm and Jesus is asleep in the back of the boat and the water's, coming over the side of the boat. And at one point, right, the disciples say to Jesus, Jesus! Don't you care that we're drowning? Wake up and do something. So if you look at that painting, you'll notice that there's one extra person in the boat. There's Jesus asleep in the back. There are the 12 disciples. But there's a 13th person in the boat. And that person looks just as terrified and frightened and overwhelmed as the 12 disciples. And if you look carefully, you'll notice that that person in the painting is Rembrandt himself. He's painted himself into the scene. That is, and that's the point. I think we kind of want to see ourselves mirrored in this story, right, that we've been reading about in the book of Numbers. Now, another thing to point out about 33 is that we get a slightly, somewhat different account of this journey in Psalm 106. And so I want to read just part of it to you, just to give you a sense of how this goes. So Psalm 106 is what's called a historical psalm in the sense that it kind of accounts or provides a summary of the history of Israel. And it does it in a pretty brief compass. Psalm 106 is not that long a psalm. It's got 48 verses. Let me read to you just a part of it, because this psalm recounts Israel's journey from Egypt to the Promised Land, but does it with some theological commentary. I'm going to start here at about Psalm 106, verse 6, and then just read a little bit of it, and I'll say a few things about it. Both we and our fathers have sinned. We have committed iniquity. We have done wickedness. Our fathers, when they were in Egypt, did not consider your wondrous works. They did not remember the abundance of your steadfast love. But they rebelled by the sea at the Red Sea, yet he saved them for his name's sake, that he might make known his mighty power. He rebuked the Red Sea, and it became dry, and he led them through the depths as through a desert. So he saved them from the hand of the foe, and redeemed them from the power of the enemy. And the waters covered their adversaries, not one was left. Then they believed his words, and they sang his praise. But they soon forgot his works. They did not wait for his counsel, but they had a wanton craving in the wilderness, and put God to the test in the desert. That is, the whole of Psalm 106 follows this pattern, right? Israel is in a moment of danger. God saves them. They're momentarily thankful, and then, almost like that, they forget what God's done for them, and they start complaining, or they rebel. So it's the same pattern, right? Deliverance, momentary thanksgiving, complaint, lapsing into sin and rebellion. Here's how the psalm concludes, and I think this is interesting too. This is Psalm 106, verses 44 and 45. It's kind of like a little kind of theological commentary on the whole thing. So, after this long story of Israel's rebellion, sinfulness, neglect, all that kind of stuff, here's what we have. Nevertheless, he looked upon their distress when he heard their cry. For their sake, he remembered his covenant and relented according to the abundance of his steadfast love. Now, what's being said here, I think is really important. That is, on one hand, right, the story that's told in the book of Numbers is a story of human weakness, human spiritual blindness, human stupidity, human ungratefulness, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it's more than that. It's also a story of God's faithfulness. That is, those last two verses of Psalm 106 ask a really important theological question, right? Why did God persist with these people who, seemingly were unable to learn anything, right? What was the deal? Right? Why didn't God just dump them all? Give them the kind of like their pink slip as the covenant people and say, goodbye, you're fired. Well, the reason for that is, right, one thing. We're told, right, God remembered his covenant. So really important point. That is, the book of Numbers makes a hugely important point that's absolutely central for both the Old Testament and the New Testament, and that is this. God does not go back on his promises. And the book of Numbers and the things that we've seen there is sort of proof of that. Okay? God enters into a covenant with the people of Israel. They're his people. And if you want to think about it this way, right? He refuses to let go of them. And there is what I call the Old Testament gospel, right? The gospel here that's being told to us in the Old Testament, right, is that having entered into a covenant with us, God refuses to let go of us, even when we want to be let go. Okay, and we often do, right? God's not going to do that. So I think that's a really important thing. Now, another thing that I want to say just a word about, and then we're going to have to stop. This is what happens in Numbers 34. Once again, it doesn't seem particularly interesting or riveting or enlightening. If I were to tell you, we're going to do a 35-part sermon series on Numbers 34, you would say, there are going to be 35 Sundays in which I'll be absent from church. Because it's just not that interesting. What we find here is God apportioning pieces of the promised land out to the various tribes. That's what it is. So, and once again, it kind of reads like a MapQuest sort of thing, or almost like a will, perhaps, right? I give, the house to so-and-so, and the jewelry to so-and-so, and the lake house to Fred, and that kind of stuff. Interesting to nobody but Fred, right? Because he's getting a lake house. What's going on here? Once again, it appears to be, random sort of semi-interesting details, but what's being said here is really, really important. By parceling out the land, two things are happening. Thing number one, because God's the one who's doing the parceling out, it's being underlined that God is the one who owns the land. Really important point, okay? Never in the whole history of Israel does anyone think of themselves as owning the land. It belongs to God. And so God's the one who portions it out. Okay, so that's one thing. The second thing is that if you read it carefully, what God tries to do in his own divine and omniscient way is that as far as possible, the apportionments of land are relatively equal. That is, obviously the bigger tribes get a bigger plot of land, right? That's natural. But the idea is that no tribe is sort of given like a huge amount of land, while some other tribe, right, is given the equivalent of a modern day house lot in Tallahassee, right? Where the houses are built so close together that, if you make a wrong turn, you end up in your neighbor's garage. No. The idea here is that the land is apportioned out in a relatively equitable way. And once again, that may not seem to be particularly interesting or revolutionary to us, but it actually is, for this reason. In the surrounding cultures that inhabit the land of Canaan, most of the land is owned by a very, 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 very small group of people. Israel is going to be consciously different on this point, okay? God's making it clear, and we've seen this as we walk through Exodus 2, right? God's design for Israel is that there not be huge inequities among his people. And so there's this effort here to apportion out land in a way that's relatively equal according to the size of the tribes. Now, one final thing, and then I'll stop. Another important thing that happens here is this. In Numbers 35, we get a thing about what are called the cities of refuge. And just very, very briefly, here's what they are. The cities of refuge are a certain set of cities that are designated so that if someone thank you, David. David's telling me to shut up. So that if someone commits a sort of accidental murder, right, involuntary homicide, they may flee to one of the cities of refuge until such time as a trial can be arranged. Now, once again, why is this important? It's important for this reason, right? One of the things we're seeing here is a concern that Israel be a just society, right? So the idea of the city of refuge, right, is so-and-so does, so-and-so, there's involuntary manslaughter. Joe flees to the city of refuge until such time as a trial can be arranged. That prevents a sort of like a mob from descending upon Joe and, doing something to him. So once again, right, there's a concern here for a certain level of justice and equity, which once again contrasts mightily with the cultures and peoples that are around the people of Israel. So what we'll try and do is we will take a look at Numbers 36 next Sunday, and then I promise that we'll get into Deuteronomy.